This is Lauren Kimball for ANI 150, and we are picking up where the last tutorial left off. In the last tutorial we explored the UV texture editor, covered some basics in the UV texture editor, and we kind of explored this little animation that kind of showed you just how UV mapping works, which is taking our 3D object, cutting it up in strategic places, and then laying it down flat. Alright? So in class, now if you're following along and you're not part of my class has been modeling little dice and cans. If you are following along with that process and already have your dice and can, go ahead and pull them out. If you are just kind of following along from somewhere else, you can go ahead and model a quick cylinder and a cube with some beveled edges. Alright? So I'm going to go ahead like before and go up to UV and activate the UV texture editor. Now this right here is the UV toolkit. We're not going to really play with that. We're going to keep texturing in this class. We're going to keep it down to just a couple of tools, so we don't need to be going through that entire editor. I'm going to click on this. We'll turn off these maps. I'm going to click on this cube here, and as you can see, the cube looks pretty decent. You know, I mean, all we did was bevel, and if I click on distortion, yeah, there's some red going on. It's flipped correctly. I mean, we would probably get away with just texturing this as is. But for the sake of demonstration, let's go ahead and just lay out the UVs for this, okay? So I'm going to begin by going up to Create and pulling off this window. These are all our different projection nodes, and pretty much all of these are based on planar map. What is a planar map? Well, let me go over here and just create a plane. Let me turn off this border. Alright, so I accidentally attached that checker pattern to the main Lambert, so now everything I create has a texture on it. Yeah, don't do that. Don't apply the texture to your default Lambert, or that's what's going to happen. Okay, so I've got this plane, and I'm going to go over to Create and apply a planar map, but I'm not just going to click it, because if I do, this weird thing happens. Do you see how this map is kind of angled wrong? Yeah, I would have to go in, click on this little red crosshair, and manually rotate this map to make it work. I don't want to do that. When you're going to planar map an object, always go in here and press the little box, and it'll give you planar mapping options. I'm going to reset these. Okay, so fit project into bounding box, that's fine. Project from which axis? Well, if I look over here to my bottom left hand corner of my screen, you can see that little compass that tells you where you are on the XYZ axis, and it looks like if I'm looking at my mesh, it's facing the y-axis. So I'm going to want it to project from the y-axis. Another thing I like to do is keep the width and height ratio, which doesn't matter a lot because this is square, but if it was, like, let's say this mesh was rectangle. Okay, I'm going to show you what this does. If I turn this off and I press apply, then my map is very square. And that maybe doesn't seem like a problem right away, but when you turn on the checker boxes, you start to notice that everything is very squished because the texture map is stretched. So in stretching the texture map, it stretched it in one direction and squished it in another. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this off. And this time I'm going to reapply the planar map. If you apply a map, the next time you apply a map is the one that it's going to acknowledge. Okay, so you can apply millions of these projections on if you wanted to. I don't know why you would, but let's just say, for sake of argument, that you weren't sure which map to apply. So you can apply multiples. I recommend deleting history. That way none of these interact with each other. Because remember, as you're working on your mesh, everything you do to your mesh is stored inside the channel box. And so you want to make sure that you're keeping that tidy by periodically going up to the polygon modeling menu and deleting history, which is this little clock with an X. Okay, so I'm going to go back into planar mapping options. I'm going to check the keep image width ratio box and apply. And you'll see that now the map looks a lot better because it's trying to maintain the original height and width ratio of your object. And when I apply the checker box this time, all the squares are perfectly square, which is what we want. So I'll turn that off now. And I'm going to probably delete this, but the point was, when I look at the map itself, so let me project it one more time. It's a flat plane, hence planar map. Makes sense. Okay, so I'm just gonna grab this and delete it. Over here, I'm gonna go ahead and grab this box, and I'm gonna apply an automatic map. And an automatic map just creates multiple planar maps that will catch all the different angles of your object. Automatic mapping is super awesome for non-organic hard surface modeling because you're usually going to deal with a lot of sharp edges and a lot of flat surfaces. So yeah, definitely great for props and things. Not necessarily ideal for organic shapes, but we'll talk about other workflows in the future. For right now, automatic mapping, awesome. So I'm going to go over here to my UV editor, right click, and grab the UV shell tool. I'm going to grab all of these, use my move tool to move them off to the right out of our texture space. So this main texture space is where we're going to ultimately pack our final UV map. We're going to pack it in there because when we take a UV snapshot, which is how we pull this UV information into Photoshop, it's only going to want to capture this texture texture plane right here. It's only going to want to grab the information here. So that's why at the end of the day, everything needs to fit into that box where the green and the red compass are, you know, hugging. Okay, so I'm gonna go over here, and if it were, I don't know, like maybe the front of a car or something, if this thing had a discernible front, then you could start there. This box is the same on all sides, so really any piece will do. I'm just gonna click a piece, drag it off to the right, and say this is going to be my main face for my box, okay? Or my dice in this case, because in class we are modeling a die. Alright, so what I want to do is kind of treat this like fabric and move and sew each one of these pieces to that main piece. Alright? So I'm going to right click and I'm going to go to edge. And is edge mode inside the UV editor is the same edge mode as perspective view. I'm going to grab that edge and, whoops, don't want to move it, sorry. Zoom out in the UV editor, and you are going to notice that while selecting that one edge here in the main camera mode only selects a single edge on your mesh, inside the UV editor it's going to show you all shells that are connected to that edge. So this shell here and this shell here. So when I have an edge selected, one thing I want to do is make sure that the size is still correct. All these pieces, if you click on the die, you can see that all these pieces have the same scale value. If this box over here, this side of the box, were much bigger, I would maybe want to clean up and adjust the UVs before I move and sew. Not a problem right now, so I'm just going to grab the edge that they share, shift right click, move and sew. And when I do that, it takes away the seam. So I'm going to undo and I'm going to activate seams. So you can see that big thick orange line that's highlighted, and when I repeat the shift right click move and sew, it goes away because the seam's gone. So if there was a texture there, that texture would be merged. That one seam's merged so that the texture wouldn't be broken on that edge is what I mean to say. So I'm going to zoom in and you'll notice there's little cuts here, and that's because the bevel is kind of rounded. Ideally, if I didn't want any stretching, so I'm going to turn this on. If I want to keep it like as pale as possible, I wouldn't necessarily sew those corners, but there's going to be a break in the texture there. So this is where I get to make the call. Do I care about the amount of distortion? I'm going to shift right click, merge and sew, because I don't care about the distortion. It's very minimal and it's not ultimately going to affect my mesh, but that's just a sort of a simple example of what I mean when I say that we need to be watching distortion versus mapping. Now there are a series of tools to help with that as far as relaxing your UVs, but we're not going to touch on those right now. We're going to try to keep this as simple as possible. Alright, I'm going to grab this edge and I'm just going to press G because I can repeat the process. And then this goes super fast. Just go through, grab these edges. When I don't even have to look after a while because it's going to automatically flip these things for you. I'm just going through, grabbing edges, sewing them, and now I've got this middle face with these three pieces on the outside. Where this piece is going to go is pretty arbitrary. I can just choose any of these boxes to sew it to. I'll just go with the bottommost edge, press G, again move those little seams there, and now I'm done. That's all there was to it. That is the moving and sewing process. So now I want to pack it. Now I could do this by hand and just sort of move it into the space and shrink it down and make sure that it's fitting. An easier way is to just shift right click. So again, that's shift right click, go to, oh not unfold, sorry. Go to layout and just click layout UVs. The default for layout is fine in this instance. It could mess up a more complex surface, so we can explore that tool in more detail when we get to more complex meshes in class, but for now this is fine. It's just going to take that shell and scale it and tuck it in really tight so that it utilizes as much of this texture space as possible. Because when you are texturing for a project, you don't want to leave a lot of negative space in that UV box. You want to make sure that everything is being utilized as best as possible. And so we're done. We're done laying out the UVs for the low poly die. Now let's move over here to the can. Now this can looks okay at first glance, but there's definitely a problem. When I activate the checkerboards, up here it's very small, little boxes are small, over here they're huge and they're also squished, so not ideal. So what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to turn off the checker because it's a little distracting, and I'm going to turn off the seams because that's also a little bit distracting. I'm going to right click and go into face mode, and I'm going to use my paint surface brush over here. Remember, you can use B to change the scale of your brush, and I'm just going to grab the faces. Now this particular face is going to be aiming on the y-axis, and you know what could be fun? I'm going to go ahead and just grab both sides at the same time. Kill two birds with one planar map. Alright, so I've grabbed these two ends of the cylinder. I'm going to go into planar map options, make sure that it's aimed on the y-axis, that I've kept the width-height ratio, and apply. And then I'm going to move what I've got outside of the box. Okay? Now, you'll notice that there's only one UV map, or it appears that, even though I had two surfaces, there's only one map. What's up with that? Well, I'm going to go back over into my UV editor and click shaded mode, and you'll notice that the main can is blue, true blue, we want it to be blue, and the can is oddly purple. Why is that? Well, I'm going to right click and go to UV shell. I'm going to grab the shell in my move tool and separate, because you have two separate UV shells stacked on top of each other. When we planar mapped it and planar mapped them together, this is the result. So remember that blue is going to be facing the correct direction, so whatever I texture on that isn't going to be flipped around. I'm going to click on the red, I'm going to hold down shift, I'm going to right click, and I'm just going to flip along U, and that's going to turn it back to blue. Now for the can, I think ideally having them separated is best, but you could do what's called stacking. You could stack by snapping to vertice and having it, hold on, snap to vertice, and having them lay perfectly on top. There is a stack tool that'll allow you to stack similar UVs. Why would you want to stack UVs? Well, let's say I'm never going to look at the bottom of the can, so it doesn't matter that the top and bottom of the can share the same texture information. If I were to paint a lid for the can and the UVs are stacked, then that texture will be shared by both spaces. Okay? So that would be why you'd want to stack. We're not going to stack in this instance. We're going to go ahead and separate them, but I still wanted to introduce the concept. Now, when we get over here to our, let's turn off that shaded mode again. Oh, made it worse. There. When we get over here to the can, and this is also helpful, instead of, I could just grab faces and just highlight the faces. You can also select faces in your UV texture editor if that's easy. You can also convert shells to face selection. UV editor is a great way to select parts of your mesh. Kind of an alternative to quick select sets to a certain degree. Alright, so a planar map is not going to do the trick here. And automatic mapping, where you're sewing together a cylinder, that's going to be a headache. Instead, we're going to try a different map type, a cylindrical map type. I'm going to click it, and I'm lucky that it was facing the right direction, but there was a very good chance it could have been rotated like this, depending on what angle the preset was. Well, I guess cylindrical map's always going to align correctly. Never mind. I must be thinking of an older version of Maya. So unlike the planar map, it doesn't look like you have to adjust the coordinates anymore, so scratch that. Alright, so when you do a cylindrical map, I'm going to do that again. Cylindrical map, this pops up. So it is a planar map. If you were to turn off polygons, it is a planar map that is essentially being curved or wrapped around a curve. Okay? And I'm going to go ahead and grab that, grab the bottom corner here. So whenever you've got a texture map, you want to go ahead and seize on this little crosshair, and that's going to just give you different tools. So the first tool is controlling the map. The second tool allows you to move, rotate, and scale the map. So I'm going to click on it once so that I'm back to controlling the map, and I'm going to grab one of these corners and just close it tight. Okay? I'm also going to go back to show polygons again. And I'm then going to go ahead, grab that little crosshair, and scale this down so that it fits a little nicer, a little less distortion. Alright, so there we have the map as it's represented. And if I turn on my squares, ooh, that does look a bit squished. Maybe I should stretch those back out. Yeah, that's okay. Alright, so I've got the side ready to go. I'm going to go UV shell here. Everything looks good. If I turn on the distortion map, nothing's distorted. Everything's looking blue when I turn on the shaded view. So now it comes down to packing, and there's a couple of options here. I could just grab these, shift right click, and and layout. Oops. But in this instance, it's made the side of my can really tiny and the lid's really big, which is not ideal. So let me talk to you a little bit about the texture space itself. With the box, there wasn't a lot that you could do about the texture space, but with this, we've got multiple pieces. The bigger an object is in this texture space, the more texture information you can pack into it. So while it's ideal that everything, here, I'm going to double click on my rotation tool. Here's one, I'm sorry, I sidetracked a little. What's really cool, I want to show you a little trick for rotating things in the UV texture editor. If you double click on the rotate tool, like you would inside of your camera view, and then click on UV editor, it gives you the rotation tools for the UV editor, which are a little different. And I like turning on step snap and rotating things so that I'm ultimately getting a perfect 90 degrees after a while. So step snap is awesome. Just gonna throw that out there. But back to the subject at hand. When you're packing, things that have lots of details should be the biggest part. And things that have less detail should take up less space. Now ideally you'd want everything to match in scale so that the surface texture is the same. So it would be something like this, where the squares are matching. But that's helpful, but it's not always necessary. If you need more texture room, you could scale the lids up. But for right now, I'm just going to have the maps match. Typically, you want things to match in scale. But again, if something requires more detail, then go ahead and let it take up more detail. If something's really small, so small you may never see it, then you could tuck it away into the smallest corner of your UV editor. So, I'm going to, now that I've got these scaled, I'm going to shift right click and layout. Actually, I don't want them to lay along U. I want them to lay out along V. There we go. And it kind of messed with the scale here. I mean, everything is uniform, but it kind of messed with the scale of this, which I wasn't a huge fan of. If you don't want the UV layout tool to mess with your scale, you can always shift right click, go into the layout tool, and you can tell it that it is not allowed to scale. So see how it says scale mode? You can also tell it not to stack shells, you can tell it not to rotate things, but We'll go into that more in different tutorials. This will be fine. All right. So now we have laid out the UVs for our can. We have, let's go to object mode. Laid out the UVs for our can. We've laid out the UVs for our die. That is done. The next step would be to take this into Photoshop. It's the last thing that we're going to cover in this tutorial, so that when we meet in class, we'll be able to pick up and start discussing the hypershade and how to assign different map types and how to build maps, etc., etc. So inside the UV texture editor, once we have a map laid out and it's just the way we want, we are going to pick on the last button that we really didn't touch too much on, and that was this camera. You click that and it's going to open up your UV snapshot options. Now, ideally, you have this set to a project. So whenever we open up a new scene in Maya, we always either create a project directory or we set it. In this case, I already have this this file set up elsewhere, so I'm just going to go File, Set Project. I'm going to ask it to go to my desktop. UV Demo is what I named it, Set. It's important that you've set your projects because it's going to output into that project. We discussed in class how if you want to bring an image into Maya, it goes in the source images folder. If you want to kick an image out of Maya, it's going to export into the images folder. So I set my project so that I know where the directory is. I click on that camera and I can see right here that it doesn't seem to have listened for some reason. Nope, no it did, it just didn't update. Okay. So it's going to export to my UV demo images. Cool. I'm going to leave that alone. Image format, I typically prefer Targas, but lately on my Mac, Targa's been crashing Maya. Not sure what's up with that, so I'm going to stick with TIFF. For scale, 2048 is great for the assignment. If you are working on a professional production, always go one scale up. So I'd be saying like 4096 instead of 2048, because you can always reduce resolution, but when you try to increase resolution from an existing texture, it is not going to work. It is going to stretch pixels, it's going to create artifacting and texture quality deterioration. So if you're working on something professional, one size larger than what you're working on. For right now, as an exercise, 2048 is fine. Lock aspect ratios, anti-aliasing lines, all this is fine. Yeah, we're good. Go ahead and just press apply and close. It says it failed to output. I'm gonna go over here, see what that's about. I'm just gonna name that. You don't usually have to name your UV snapshot. I'm just naming it because I think something went awry here. For some reason, apply and close. Okay. I don't know what was up with that, but I'm working on a Mac, so just roll with it. So I'm going to go into my, let's see, where is that folder? My UV demo. Inside my images folder, you will find what is the UV snapshot, this right here. And we will move beyond this in class, but for right now, this is as far as I would like you to get on your exercise. I'm going to publish on Canvas tutorials that I've already recorded for the Sci-Fi Crate, so if you have moved beyond the exercise and started modeling the Sci-Fi Crate, which I highly recommend you get on, you can go ahead and start laying out the UVs and packing UVs for that assignment. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you all in class. And for everybody who's watching this tutorial who is not in my class, I hope you enjoy. Alright, bye y'all.